Well, hello. Thank you for coming to City Space. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your support to WBUR. So my name is Bruce Gellerman. I'm a reporter with the Earthwhile team, which is a team of 3 reporters and producers and editors, and we cover the environment. We've been doing this for about the better part of a year. It's a real commitment on the part of the station to cover environmental news and information. It's unique in the sense that even most of the networks don't even have a dedicated environmental reporter. We have 3. So we do a lot of local and regional coverage. Tonight's discussion on climate is actually the second event in WBUR City Space Get Educated series. From now through November, we'll be diving very deep into issues that will define the 2020 presidential election and trying to help people and voters understand the nuances of the issues so that you can truly make an informed choice. And they're all free, so you have to register. Thank you for coming. You can find out more about the upcoming events. Just go online to the WBUR.org City Space website. So today, in case you didn't know, is the day after, maybe it's the day of the Iowa caucuses, we don't know. It's like Groundhog's Day or something, right? But a year from today, exactly, is the presidential election. And the day after is what? Does anybody know what the day after the presidential election is? Exactly. It's the day that we will be, unless something changes, that the United States withdraws from the Paris Climate Accord. So that occurs the day after the national election. So that kind of puts a point on really our conversation today. And we have 3 really incredible people to have this conversation. We'll invite your questions afterwards. We'll go about half hour, maybe a little longer, and then take your questions. We'll get you out in times to see or listen to the State of the Union address. So starting with the left to right. So Yanisa, you're gonna have to help me. I've been practicing, but I'm going to destroy her last name.
Okay, yeah.
Yanisa, how do you pronounce your name?
It's Yanisa Teshakamtan. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Yanisa is with the Sunrise Movement. What do you do?
So I'm the electoral lead of the Boston hub of the Sunrise Movement, and I know some of you were expecting Varshini Prakash to be up here tonight, but she had to stay in Iowa for an extra day for reasons. So you have me instead. Yeah.
So what do you do with the Sunrise Movement here?
Yeah, so I lead our electoral team, and in the electoral team we work with a lot of candidates and politicians who are trying to pass real just climate policies at all the levels of government. And in addition to that, I also help with the National Sunrise Movement and help coach new hubs that are forming on political strategy.
How big is the Sunrise Movement in terms of number of people that are involved in it?
Ooh, it's grown a lot over the last year. So
3 years it's been in existence, right?
Yes, so it started with maybe 6 people, all in their 20s, coming from a lot of fossil fuel divestment movements, other college movements, and they came together and realized that there needs to be a lot more climate action pretty much everywhere, at all levels of government, at all levels of institutions, and that's grown from those 9 people to, I want to say we're multiple thousands now. The Boston hub itself, we have probably about 100, 200 really active members, and our listserv has 2,000 at this point, I think. And that's just Boston.
And you endorse the Green New Deal?
Yes, we are. We fully endorse the Green New Deal, and we are fighting for it every day.
Congressman Carlos, how do I pronounce it? Curbelo, welcome. You're from Miami. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the invitation, although people from Miami rarely accept invitations to come to Boston in February for whatever reason, maybe a bad reason. It's not too cold today, so thanks for that. I served in Congress for 4 years. I represented the southern tip of Florida, so southwestern Miami all the way down to Key West. ground zero for sea level rise in the Florida Keys and South Florida. Climate change is not a debate in theory. It's a daily experience in fact and in reality. So we're a community that I think has a far more developed conscience when it comes to environmental issues. And of course we have the ocean to our east and the Everglades to our west. Everglades restoration, the greatest restoration project in the history of the world, the largest. So this is an issue that I realized I didn't have a choice but to lead on while I was in Congress, and I did a lot of work on the Republican side of the aisle to kind of loosen the soil, and it took some time, but some of the benefits of those seeds that were planted are starting to be reaped today.
And Elizabeth Turnbull Henry from Elm.
Hey.
Hi. So I met Elizabeth when I did one of the first stories of my political career. I don't do a lot of politics, but I was asked to do a story about the governor's environmental record, right? His report card as he was going to be reelected. And you had just joined Elm.
That's right. So the Environmental League of Massachusetts, it turned 121 last summer. We've been on Beacon Hill since 1898, pushing for Massachusetts to do what it does best, which is to lead. And we think Massachusetts can lead the nation in environmental policy, that we can do for climate what we've done for healthcare and marriage equality. It's worth mentioning that the Environmental League, while we're a state-focused organization, we're also the state affiliate for the League of Conservation Voters, which means that we're part of this really rich and exciting network of 30 other state organizations that are modeling state leadership in the absence of and sometimes in spite of going backwards at the federal level.
Before the Elm, you were with Adidas?
I was, yeah. I led the climate and energy program for the owned operations at Adidas.
You got an MBA from Yale.
Yeah.
And while you were there, tell me if this is true. Is it true that you built an apartment, a building of 122 square feet?
I didn't know you were going to ask about this. Yes, I built a tiny house. It's like the weirdest part about my life. But I did. I lived in a little 144 square foot house on wheels that I built.
On wheels?
On wheels.
Where is it?
I gave it away. I got married and I had some kids, and the tiny house felt a little tiny. So there's a network of tiny houses for the homeless up in Vermont. So mine is there.
So I want to just lubricate the conversation with some audio. So we'll play just a vox pop, a voice of the people, but these are not people of the populace. These are candidates. So these are some of the candidates that you're going to be hearing a lot of, or have heard a lot of. And we'll listen to that in about a minute and 20 seconds.
Not only can we clean up the air and water in the black and brown communities where our pollution is concentrated.
No, that's
But I want clean air, I want clean water, and I also want jobs, though. I don't want to close up our industry because somebody said, you have to go with wind.
One that is bearing down on us are the consequences of climate change worldwide. We should be at zero carbon emission. We should do this, and we should do this as quickly as possible. We shouldn't be looking at 2050. We should be looking at 2040, 2030.
I think it's possible for the next president to reverse the trajectory toward climate ruin that we're on today. Can you do it in 4 years? Of course not. But that's exactly why we need to act with the most urgency ever.
My dream is to convince countries around the world that instead of spending $1.5 trillion a year on weapons of destruction, that maybe we stand together against a common enemy and we invest in transforming our energy system away from fossil fuel.
We shouldn't build another new highway in America that doesn't have charging stations on it, creating millions of jobs for people installing them, as well as making sure that we own the electric vehicle market. There's so many things we can do, and we have to make sure we explain it to those people who are displaced that their skills are going to be needed for the new opportunity.
Not only can we clean up the air and water in the black and brown communities where our pollution is concentrated, this is also the opportunity to create literally millions of middle-class union jobs well paid across the United States of America. Our biggest crisis is our biggest opportunity. And if we don't declare a state of emergency on day one, I don't understand how we go to the people around the world to lead the coalition that has to happen and that only America can lead.
I got to tell you, it's hard to find clips from the candidates, many of the candidates, about climate change. It stunned me. I did this afternoon, and I was very surprised. So the question is, how big a deal is climate change playing as a political issue in this presidential campaign so far? Elizabeth.
Sure. Well, I guess two things. There was not a single question about climate in 2016 in any of the main debates, right? So I think, on one hand, I think we should be proud that the conversation has advanced as far as it has. I mean, I think if you look at all of the viable presidential candidates, and I know we're all like pushing refresh on our phone right now to see, but there is a pretty high minimum bar that all of the Democratic candidates have set for their climate policies. All of them, arguably, have science-based goals. They are calling out that there are going to be communities that are really impacted, and that we need to make sure that we are taking care of those that have either historically borne more of the burden of pollution and climate change or most vulnerable, and considering that we need to transition fossil fuel workers to dignity conferring work. So I think I'm really pleased, and I take heart from just the baseline policies. What I think is missing are two things. One, this has to be the number one priority. I mean, the day they are sworn in, we need a whole cascade of initiatives. And so that, to have the candidates really be reflecting the urgency that I know I feel, and I think we all feel about climate. And two, to know that he or she will use all of the powers of their presidency.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. And I would say even, Biden's climate plan is still, there's been a lot of improvement over the years in terms of, even Biden's plan is much better than what President Obama's plan was less than a decade ago, though obviously it's still not enough in a lot of ways. And I think one part that is missing from a lot of the way that these candidates speak about climate change is how climate change will impact a lot of the other problems that they are trying to solve. So climate change will impact healthcare. Climate change will impact job security. Climate change will impact housing, a lot of other issues.
So are you satisfied with the degree of conversation so far around climate change in the run-up to the primaries?
I'm not satisfied in the way I was talking about before, in that people are talking about climate change more, but not enough in telling us that it will kind of impact every other facet of society as well. And I think a lot of candidates are just looking at it as one more issue rather than one that encompasses every other issue.
Mm-hmm. I should say, Congressman, that I was hoping you'd toot your own horn a little bit more, actually. So you were Republican in an administration that did not celebrate climate change. How tough was it? I mean, you were a part of what's called the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus, and they're actually having a hearing tomorrow on the health implications, and you're not there. But are you satisfied with the Republican Party's position on climate?
Well, I don't think anyone can be satisfied until this gets solved, until we get meaningful federal climate policy that will put us in a position to lead the world and obviously drastically reduce carbon dioxide emissions. But everything in life is perspective. And even though for those of us who follow the issue of climate change and climate science, I think every day is a little depressing because we know how massive the problem is, how challenging it is, and how it literally is getting worse by the day. However, if we believe that this is an issue that requires a global solution, which it does, and if there's going to be a serious global solution, the United States must lead because we are by far the most relevant and powerful country in the world. And if the United States is going to lead, we will need both parties to work constructively on this issue if we're going to have durable, lasting policy that will not swing with the political winds. And in that regard, we're in a much better position today than we were a year ago, and certainly than 5 years ago when I arrived in Congress. Back then, there were 247 House Republicans. It was the largest majority since the Great Depression. And I learned about this issue. I knew about it growing up in Florida, but I really tried to learn a lot more once I got to Congress, had a series of meetings with NOAA, with other agencies and environmental groups, and I realized I had to step out and lead on this because my community was so exposed. It was just the right thing to do. And that's not me, is it? No, I'm just glad it wasn't me. So sounded like the Calm app, which I have on my phone. Helps me go to sleep. So anyway, back to this issue. I couldn't find, out of 247, I found maybe 4 or 5 Republicans who were willing to acknowledge climate change, talk about it, and sit with me and figure out what we could do. 4 or 5. Ryan Costello, Lee Stefanik, and a couple more. And, we realized we had a big problem. We got to work. We introduced a resolution just acknowledging climate change. Got, I think, 11 or 12, maybe up to 13 Republicans on that, and then started this caucus where anyone who wanted to join, it was open to both parties, but anyone who wanted to join had to join with a member of the opposing party, so you could not join alone. And that was our best idea, and I really don't think we put that much thought into it. We thought it was cute, but what that triggered was hundreds of conversations between members of Congress, usually Democrats approaching Republicans saying, hey, you're my friend, I'm joining this caucus, this is the purpose of it, we want to establish a dialogue. And by the end of my time in Congress, we had 45 Republicans and 45 Democrats. So from 4 to 5, when I arrived in Congress, we had 45 who were on the record acknowledging the issue, recognizing that the government had a role in addressing it, and giving their constituents and the media a tool by which to hold them accountable. Because all of a sudden, you're in the Climate Solutions Caucus, well, now we're going to ask you about your voting record and whether or not that's consistent with membership in a caucus. So it was just a major step forward, very quiet, didn't get much attention. And, then since I, lost my election and left Congress at the beginning of last year, the growth on the Republican side has just been extraordinary. And, of course, insufficient, but still extraordinary. This is a party that just a few years ago was driven by either people who didn't care about the issue or by some denialists, a very small subset of the Republican Party, but loud. Well, today, the Republican Party is saying that they're going to solve climate change. That's what House Republicans said just a couple weeks ago after a closed-door meeting, and people may laugh and snicker and be skeptical, and you should be, but language is a leading indicator. Once people change their tune, everything else inevitably comes after. So I am sanguine and optimistic and very hopeful these days.
But I saw a recent Pew poll that said 27% of Republicans that they polled said climate change was an important issue for them, major issue. 87% Democrats. How do you?
Well, what's moving Republicans is a combination of the science, which is indisputable, and you'll find very few Republicans outside of the White House challenging the science these days. And then, of course, the politics. That 27% number is not irrelevant. And then if you poll younger Republicans, you definitely get over 50%. And these politicians, they're in business like everyone else, and they want to have a future. And they understand increasingly. And Kevin McCarthy, the House Republican leader, was actually very transparent about this. He said, this next generation wants us to be a part of the solution. And if we're not, we're going to have trouble winning future elections. So, of course, the motivations are at least in part political, but I don't care why people do things as long as they do good things, even if by accident.
Elizabeth, do you think climate, of all the Democrats, is that a winning issue for them?
Oh my God, yes. I mean, you gave me a heads up that we might be talking about polling, and I don't usually read USA Today, but I was at a hotel a couple weeks ago, and I was struck that even USA Today, the cover of USA Today says, this says hidden ground on climate change. Voters actually agree on climate change fixes, so why no action? And my answer is, I think we're at a point where we have the science, and we have the economics, and we have the technology, but we don't always have the politics. But what we do have is the polling data. And, one of the things that has struck me, I guess, two comments related to polling. One, across the political spectrum, almost any way you cut it, across every category of race and class and age and party, I think a majority of voters want climate solutions. And, the USA Today mentions a poll that they did, UNH's Granite State poll, 70% of residents in New Hampshire want 100% clean energy by 2050. Monmouth, Des Moines Register, Pew, others. I think you're seeing attitudes changing on climate faster than on almost any other issue. And among Democrats, to answer the question that you asked, climate is consistently polling 1 or 2. It typically lags healthcare, but just a little bit. And to your point, it's so intertwined with healthcare. I mean, I think it is absolutely a galvanizing issue for Democratic voters.
There was an entrance poll in Iowa. They don't do exit poll because everybody leaves at the same time. So they do entrance polls, and NBC did a poll, and it showed that climate was the number 3 issue. The first one, what was the first one? What do you think?
Healthcare.
Second. First one was get rid of Trump. So the second was healthcare, and the third was that. What was missing from the mix, interesting, and I've learned to read these polls with a great deal of skepticism, was they didn't ask people about jobs or the economy in that. So,
Can I pile on for a minute?
Sure.
So one of, I think polling in general gives me a lot of hope and optimism about November, but one thing that does give me pause is that I've seen research that swing voters are not that aware of how bad Trump is. And that
in terms of climate.
In terms of climate environment. They sort of know, generally, he's probably not, been really great. He's not led on it, sure. But they don't realize that he has rolled back, destroyed almost 100 environmental policies. That, according to his own EPA, we've had 15% more bad air quality days during his administration. I mean, there's just, basic voter education that needs to be done between now and November so that people realize just that he has been the worst voter or the worst president on environmental issues in the history of the American democracy.
Would you agree with that?
I think it'd be hard to disagree with his policies have done great damage. But let me just say, although I think probably for everyone in this room, this is very clear and obvious, don't assume that any of this is going to be easy, even within the Democratic Party. A lot of people thought that cap and trade would be a slam dunk. Democrats controlling 60 Senate seats and having an overwhelming House majority, and nothing happened. Nothing. Couldn't even get a hearing in the Senate. So this is going to be difficult. And although a lot of people respond in polls that they want to see this solved, as you start putting solutions before them, that's when it gets tougher. It's just like most people say that they want the U.S. budget to be balanced. Maybe whatever, 80%. So, okay, well, these are the things we're going to have to do. Well, no, we're against all of those things. So we should be optimistic, but we should learn the lesson of 2009 and 2010, and this will be very difficult. There are very few members of Congress in either party who would happily vote to raise gas prices, and
yet you're a proponent of putting a carbon tax.
Well, but here's what I did, because I wanted my proposal to be politically realistic. I proposed a tax on carbon that included a repeal of the gasoline tax, because I know that the minute that comes up, a lot of people are going to run away. This country's obsessed with gasoline prices. Gasoline prices spike, it's front page, and it leads the news. And that's why I said, I just want to take that issue off the table. Anyone says, oh, no, but, people are going to suffer with gasoline prices. No, they're not. No, they're not. We're repealing the gas tax. The net effect on gasoline will be almost zero. But, we'll be taxing emissions for the first time in our country, and I think that's worth, in my opinion, giving up the gasoline tax to have a broader tax on emissions that captures more of the economy, and that the wealthy person driving the Tesla and plugging into a coal plant is not getting a free pass, right?
He mentioned that the youth are going to play a big role in this.
Yeah.
How big a role?
Pretty big role. Carlos, you mentioned how we have to learn from the lessons of 2008 and 2009 when the Waxman-Markey bill didn't pass, even though Democrats had a majority in Congress. And I think something that we have learned from that is that while the bill was really good for its time, it didn't have a lot of the popular support in terms of if you look outside of the political world, outside of Congress, like people weren't in the streets shouting for climate change in a way that people are now. And I think in Sunrise, we talk a lot about how like political power has to be paired with people power. And with that people power, that kind of influences how politicians would act. That influences, like, for example, if people care about climate change, but is it their top priority? And if it is their top priority, then politicians will kind of react to that a lot more. So in terms of the youth vote, climate is a huge issue for young people, especially because we'll be alive long enough to experience a lot of its impacts. And we'll also be kind of,
how do you sell something that's going to affect your grandchildren?
So,
how do you, because it's like the frog in the water gets warmer, right? Except in this case, we're the frogs.
Yeah.
And so how do you, without scaring the hell out of people, how do you give them the sense of immediacy? Because we're at a tipping point, right? I mean, if you look at the carbon budget, which is the global amount of carbon we can dump in before science tells us that we have reached a place where there could be runaway climate change, right? You start having the permafrost, the frost, and all the methane from there runs into the atmosphere. How do you do that? What's the message?
So the message is selling something, showing people that there could be a better world from switching away from fossil fuels. And that, for Sunrise, is packaged in the Green New Deal, which, would you like me to explain that?
Yeah, because you've got a 10-year fuse. I mean, you say you want to be carbon net zero? Or
net zero by 2030.
Net zero by 2030.
Yes. So that's our goal. And the Green New Deal is a 10-year, so let me back up a bit. The Green New Deal broadly is a climate solution that offers a solution that actually fits the scale of the climate crisis while also making sure that no one gets left behind. So the Green New Deal is a 10-year mobilization strategy. It's not just one plan or one resolution, but it has the main goals of 100% renewable energy, rebuilding our infrastructure so that we don't have to rely on fossil fuels. It means guaranteeing people good, well-paying jobs that don't affect the planet. It means that we're prioritizing frontline communities who've been hurt by climate change a lot in the past, and it means guaranteeing clean water and air for everyone.
Where's the money come from? Because he just took away the federal tax on gas. Where's the money coming from?
So there's a lot of ways to answer that question, and that question has been asked a lot. And one way is that if you look at if we don't do anything, like what happens, that will cost a lot to the world in terms of healthcare costs, in terms of like failing infrastructure costs, in terms of maintenance costs. And also the US has been impacted, or we've had different changes that in the total budget before that have that have also impacted how much revenues and expenses we have. And we've been fine. A lot of times it's like tax cuts that kind of hurt the revenue side of things, and no one really asked how we're going to pay for that.
Congressman, you supported tax cuts. in the president's tax cut, right?
Well, he calls it his tax hit bill, but I was on the Ways and Means Committee, so it's actually our tax.
Okay. Is that a realistic goal, 2030 net zero entire U.S. economy?
I have to answer your question honestly, and I would say it's not. It's just not realistic. You know, a lot of people mock carbon neutrality by 2050. It would be probably the greatest achievement in the history of humanity if we were able to do that. And look, I think there's obviously room for an infinite number of ideas in this debate because it's such a threat to our existence and to everything. But having served in Congress, having seen how difficult it is to build coalitions and to keep people together, especially today, in an era of hyper-partisanship, and all of that gets amplified in social media, and it's very difficult. So I think we have to be realistic, and we also have to take progressive improvement. You know, we may not get everything we want tomorrow, but if we can reduce emissions, that's a good thing. You know, before I used to be a little cynical about state and local efforts and say, well, that's just a drop in the bucket. That's really not enough. But no, I was wrong. I've come to realize that it's not just the reduction in emissions, because sure, that's small compared to what we have to do worldwide, but it creates political pressure, positive political pressure on the federal government, and slowly you can get to the same outcome. I used to say we just got to focus on Congress, and it's not that easy. It requires a ground up, a top down from every angle. But if we want to have that durable, realistic policy, we're going to need both parties. We're going to need both parties, and I fear that. For example, I came across someone the other day and said, well, you're asking progressives to welcome those Republicans who want to be constructive here. And the individual said, no, before we do that, they have to apologize. Okay, if a colleague who had opposed me for 2 years one day came and brought a bill and said, hey, this is my compromise bill that I want to work on with you. I said, no, first apologize. I'm not going to get very much done. So anyway, I can't emphasize. This is one of the issues where, both parties have to make this decision on every issue. Do we want to solve this issue, or do we want to keep it and use it to punish the other party in the next election? That's a decision that you have to make. I saw this with immigration. I've dedicated so much capital to solving immigration because and I come from an immigrant community, it has been used for so long by both sides. Really, the people are actually, it's gone to the point where they're victims of the politicians who refuse to meaningfully address the issue, not victims of other injustices.
I have to ask you this question. What makes you a Republican in today's Republican Party? I'm not being facetious. I'm not.
Look, I'm for free markets. I believe in a limited role for government. I think government should intervene when markets fail, and this is an obvious example of that. I'm for a activist foreign policy. That doesn't mean interventionist. I just believe the United States should lead in the world. That was one of the big reasons I oppose the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, because it's an abdication of U.S. leadership. Okay. So those are the reasons. And of course, I disagree, and a lot has been written about my confrontations with the president. But I'm not going to leave the party just because he happens to be the head of it now, because I believe in fixing institutions and improving them. I mean, I'm still a Catholic, so clearly, I don't think you cut and run from institutions. And I think this country's got two parties. They both should be viable alternatives for the American people, because otherwise you have one-party rule. And my parents fled a country where they have one-party rule.
Elizabeth, what's the one thing you want to hear about from the politicians in climate? What is it that you need? And would you vote for a Republican who said it?
Yeah, I would. I mean, I guess I thought some of what you said was quite powerful. I think that it's a shame that climate feels like such a partisan issue at this moment in time, when it's going to impact a lot of people very negatively if we don't act. And I think, building on what you said, Eunice, I think there's a version of the world of the future that's actually incredibly bright. If we are visionary and organized and principled, we could create an amazing future for ourselves and our kids. And that's part of what inspires me so much about you and the Sunrise Movement. This idea that we could make 1 + 1 is 3 if we, if we really put our minds to it. So, yeah, I think if there is a politician who is willing to address the urgency of the climate crisis with the vision and the resources and the courage that it requires, he or she would have my vote.
Would you be surprised that if Trump tonight in the State of the Union address talks about climate?
Can I address that? Because no, I won't. I wouldn't be surprised at all. And I think that's because in 2016, I mean, you guys heard the clip, right? Like, in 2016, he said climate change is a Chinese hoax. And just a couple weeks ago, he said, and I actually wrote it down, oh, nothing's a hoax. Nothing's a hoax about that. It's a very serious subject. I want clean air. I want clean water. I want the cleanest air. I want the cleanest water. Trump is, the environment is very important to me. Someone wrote a book that I'm an environmentalist. I'd like to get it. I have it in the office. In fact, I printed it out. Donald J. Trump, an environmental hero. It's an actual book. And it's written by Edward Russo, who has worked for Trump for years.
He lives in Key West.
He lives in... Bless you. But I think, look, Trump is actually, he's crazy, but he's kind of crazy like a fox. And he's seeing the polling stuff that we talked about. He's seeing that majorities of voters across all race and class and creed recognize that climate is a problem. And they're seeing, and so I think you're going to see, in fact, I would bet $1 to anybody that you are going to see, you're going to see some kind of greenwashing tonight at 9 p.m. And it's going to be the beginning of Trump's revisionist history about I'm the best environmentalist on the planet. And
And you should process it for what it is, but I think you should also feel a little optimistic that at least he feels the need to change course or to
Can he win?
hide the reality of his own record, because that means things are changing. If things hadn't changed, he'd go up and say it's a hoax again. So the
can he
fact
win
that,
without?
the fact that the political environment has changed is something we should celebrate.
Can he win the presidency without becoming kind of embracing climate change in some way, shape, or
I mean,
form?
I'm sure he could, but it would be harder. In states like Florida, again, this is not, when people are experiencing saltwater intrusion and tidal flooding, it's not a joke anymore. It's personal. And Florida's a critical state, and there are others. Virginia, more of a blue state these days, but still, it's a major issue. In Virginia Beach, some of these southern states, South Carolina,
North
Louisiana, now it's like, okay, people aren't laughing anymore, and this is all provoking a change in the politics, and that's good. We don't want, I tell people we could do two things. We could try to get both parties in a good position. Obviously, Republicans are the ones who need the most help. Or we can wait and solve this when we get, 64, 5 Democrats in the Senate. And because, you'll lose Manchin, you'll lose probably a few. And a Democratic majority in the House that's large, and a Democratic president. We have two options. Those are the two options. And I think bipartisanship is the most logical and probably the most likely way that this gets solved.
Anissa, what role, so you think kids are going to play a pivotal role in this election?
Yeah, I think so. At least like young people who can vote, and also the people who cannot vote, who are still kind of on the streets fighting every day for climate action.
Because I was looking at a statistic that says that the largest cohort of voters, new voters, are minorities.
Yes.
Members of the minority, they're Black, Latino, and so on. So that would have to get mobilized, and yet there was supposedly a lot. The question was, are a lot of the turnout of this Iowa caucuses was lower than they had anticipated. They were expecting like 240,000 people. It's 170,000. Not a lot of a very small number of first-time voters. So can you mobilize those people?
Yeah, and I think I saw something else that was saying how even though like Iowa numbers had lower voter turnout than usual, the like percentage from 17 to 34 or something was a good amount higher.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I think for both getting more young people to vote and getting more people of color to vote, there has to be something that, like, presidential candidates have to show that they're fighting for those groups, right? Like, there's a lot of, in a way that's more than just kind of like giving like, I don't know, here and there.
I find it interesting that the youngest voters, the Sunrise Movement,
Yes.
is supporting the oldest candidate,
Yes.
right?
And I think it's because he provides that vision of the world, what the world could be without fossil fuels, what the world could be if we have healthcare, if we have reproductive rights, if we don't have people in our schools killing classmates.
I want to show a graph here. This is from a candidate who hasn't been in caucus. This is the Bloomberg, so it's his news organization. And can we show that? There's two Bloomberg graphics. So you watch. Oh no, that's not it. That's the climate policy. Here it is. So this is the carbon clock, right? You've seen this. It's called the Keeling graph, and it goes back to what 1960, but you can see the increase of carbon by the second. And now we'll take a look at the second clock or the second chart, and I'll show you this. So we've really escalated. That's not the second chart. So we're about 414 parts per million, which is, significant. That puts us on about a trajectory of about 2 degrees centigrade by 2030, right? I think that's where that puts us, which is half a degree centigrade above where the UN IPCC tells us we need to be. So this is the chart at where we are, 1.05 as of December. And you can see the last 5 years have been the hottest, and you've heard this, the hottest in recorded history. 2019 was the second hottest. Now, so you put the two charts together and you say, well, there's a correlation between the emissions and temperature, and that's not necessarily causation, but it is, if you apply the science and the models, which have been pretty damn good, actually, at predicting where we would be given certain scenarios, we are really in a bad way. This election, it puts the world, maybe I'm wrong, on a catastrophic course. Am I being an alarmist?
No. I mean, I think this is the most consequential election maybe ever. It feels that way to me.
Well, Bruce, the problem, though, with what you're saying is that if you're kind of saying that if Trump gets reelected, it's over, and we should be hopeless. And I'm not willing to concede that because, number one, I'm more hopeful these days, as I said earlier. The trends in Congress are clear, and that's not going to change whether Trump gets reelected or not. Of course, the pace of the change might be altered, which is significant. I don't mean to downplay the significance of the election specifically when it comes to this issue. However, I would not want everyone to give up if Trump gets reelected.
He would call me a prophet of doom. I think that's the term
Because
he used at Davos last week.
This is
right?
an issue that we just can never give up on. And of course, every election, we have to prioritize this issue. And that it's also a hopeful time because think about it. We're at the threshold of the first election in our country's history where climate will be a top issue. That's unavoidable. And that is, again, evidence of progress, of how far we've come.
I guess to play off of that, so I personally like to call Sunrise the most cautiously optimistic organization I've been a part of, and that's because it recognizes the optimism in terms of fighting for climate change, but also recognizes the work that needs to go into the optimism. So I would say a lot of the reason that climate is on the agenda right now is because people put it there. It's not because people are just realizing that more and more climate impacts, or people are getting more and more impacted by climate change. It took the work of organizing. It took the work of people always. It took the work of people remaining optimistic, even when Trump got elected, even when Trump could get reelected now. And I see this election as, yes, it's important in terms of in terms of potentially getting meaningful climate action, but it's also we can't just be doomers when if Trump gets reelected. Yeah, and because like Carlos was saying, we can't just stop doing anything, right? So and I think to not be doomers, I think it takes more than a politician. It takes the public to celebrate the successes in our progress, but to keep pushing and keep mobilizing people to keep pushing on this vision that we have for a better world.
And business, we're going to take your question. So we have a microphone that's going to roam around here. So just raise your hand and Alex will give you the mic here.
Oh, thank you. I'm the first one. My name is Patrick Tai. I come from Cambridge. I have a very short suggestion. I think the word climate change is too tame, too ambiguous. Change can be for the good or for the bad. Mm-hmm. I think it will be more relevant, more shocking to say climate crisis or climate emergency. As Mr. Congressman Curbolo say, what did you say? You say language. You say language is a leading indicator. It is a leading indicator. Not being raised speaking English, I'm very sensitive to the language and what it means. And I think climate change would be better phrased as climate crisis.
I like climate disruption. That's the one, but do you have a favorite way of phrasing it, or because 3 years ago people were talking about global warming, and it hadn't the same resonance as climate change, right? In fact, one of the polls that I could have shown you is they changed it, the phrasing of language.
I also think it's very powerful to localize the issue. So in South Florida, we talk about saltwater intrusion. That's real to people. They understand it. Climate change is more vague. Obviously, crisis is calls your attention a little more, but still, some people might say, "Well, I don't see any crisis. It's a beautiful day. We had wonderful weather for the Super Bowl in South Florida the other day." So, in every community, it's different. For some communities, it's an agricultural crisis. For others, other parts of the world, it's in South Florida, we have our reefs are dying. I mean, we need to make this issue visible to every community and not pose it as just a theory or a religion that everyone should believe in, because some people are just naturally predisposed against that. So make it about them and how it's affecting their lives. I think that's the most effective way of advancing the cause. Something I would tell Republicans in Congress is say, hey, you know how you always talk about fiscal crisis and how we need to get our budget in order. Well, just like we're leaving a financial debt for future generations, we're also leaving an environmental debt, and that's just as selfish, maybe probably more dangerous. So, and then they would get it because they understand fiscal in theory. Although I'll confess to you, the fiscally responsible party in Congress is always the minority party. It doesn't matter if that's Republicans or Democrats. If you're in power, you spend money. That's what they all do. Then they understood it and said, okay, this is, I can think about this and explain it the way I talk about fiscal issues.
But it's also a social justice issue, right? I mean, part and parcel of climate change is that people that are of lesser means, live in different communities, are subjected to the effects of climate. And how do you get that part of it together?
Yeah, well, I know a lot of work has been done in recent years, and I think we've just learned to be more sensitive. I remember when Secretary Clinton said we're going to shut down these coal plants. Look, if we understand what she meant, but if you work at one of these facilities, that's offensive.
The irony is that it was a fossil fuel that's taking those coal jobs away.
That's a separate matter. But and this other idea we used to say all the time, oh no, we'll just retrain those people and they do other jobs. That's demeaning. So say, hey, what do you do? Well, we're going to take you and teach you something else. So in my bill, we had an option for coal workers where they could retire with full benefits for the rest of their life. And, it would be like a hero's send-off. Hey, you helped build up this country. Of course, it was a time when we didn't know what the consequences of all of this was. You sacrificed.
And where's that?
A lot of these people
Where does that
got
money coming
sick.
from?
Huh?
And where does that money come from?
From the carbon tax. Yeah, my bill would not have added a cent to the deficit.
So we're not using the tax to build the roads or repair the bridges. We're using
No. Most of it would go to fund the Highway Trust Fund. But this, you'd be surprised how inexpensive it is to deliver full-time retirement benefits for coal workers. It's very small from a federal budget standpoint.
So we're really talking about questions. Oh, I'm sorry.
Hi. I want to say a couple things. One is I really appreciate hearing Carlos. I didn't know you before, and I love how your language. And I am very close to someone who's very involved in the Sunrise Movement, and I still don't fully understand what you do. So what I'd like to ask is, there's a lot of talk here about politics, and I really appreciate the sort of inner view of what's going on in Congress and what you've done, Carlos. But what I would like to know from each of you three is, what exactly is your organization doing, or the people who are working for you, Yanisa, or in your organization doing today? And what do you do now, Carlos, that you're no longer in Congress? And what does your organization do, Elizabeth?
Oh, I can start. Yeah.
Thank you.
So Sunrise is a movement of a lot of people. So there are, in terms of the staff at the national level who are paid by the organization, they're building both like I was saying before, the people power side and the political power side. So we have people focused on expanding Sunrise and expanding kind of our rhetoric in terms of we need a Green New Deal to solve the climate crisis. And we also have people working on the policy side, working with politicians to draft the building blocks of this Green New Deal. In a lot of the hubs, they're completely volunteer run. Like, I'm a volunteer. My day job is a transportation planner. And I try to link a lot of my work with the work I do outside of transportation planning. And Sunrise Boston in particular, we're focused on a few different initiatives right now, one of which is building up to the next climate strike on Earth Day, which is the 50th anniversary of the first Earth Day. Another of which is building up our justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion initiative so that we provide a space for people who are most hurt by climate change to have a voice in this new political world that's really confusing, and it's the first time for a lot of us organizing.
Are you knocking on doors in New Hampshire this week? And were you knocking on doors in Iowa?
Yes, so we had sunrisers in both Iowa and New Hampshire this past week, and we'll probably be going to New Hampshire again this week. Yeah. And we also do a lot of not just federal level. For in the like my electoral team, we spent the last half of last year working on city council endorsements and then knocking doors for city councilors, and we got 6 out of our 7 endorsed candidates elected. Yeah.
Elizabeth, you want to try? Carlos, go
I
for
want
it.
to go first. We all have to answer. So.
Sure. So thank you for the question. So ELM is, like I said, we're an old and venerable advocacy organization focused on state policy. Right now, our top 3 policy priorities, where we're spending most of our energy, are the 3 ways that we think that we can bend the curve on emissions here in Massachusetts. So we are pushing really hard for the offshore wind projects that we have secured to come online, and we're advocating for more offshore wind procurements. Our goal is to power every home in New England with offshore wind, and it's actually not a crazy goal. Second, transportation emissions now represent the single largest share of emissions in the Commonwealth, and so it's a really big nut to crack. We're working to put a price on carbon, on pollution from tailpipes, and we're advocating for the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which is like a regional essentially cap and invest program for carbon. I'd be happy to like get a glass of wine with anybody and talk about TCI later, because it's a little complicated but quite elegant, and it could be a game changer for the region.
And the idea of a carbon tax, a regional carbon tax on fuels, would be to change people's behavior, right?
Yeah, I mean, it puts a sort of very pretty nominal fee actually on the carbon, but then it would create a pool of resources that could be reinvested in low carbon mobility, and it's that reinvestment strategy which really is the magic sauce for TCI. So this could unlock $500 million a year for Massachusetts to put into the T or into rural transportation authorities. And the third priority just is we always advocate for the state budget. It's always a surprise for people to learn that Massachusetts really underinvests in our environmental agencies, our Department of Conservation and Recreation, DEP, DOER. So long-term, our goal is to double the capacity of our state agencies to both do their core jobs and then to address the climate crisis. And we do that, so we have a policy advocacy group, but we also have a large and growing action fund. And so we partner with Sunrise and with other 501c4 organizations. We endorse candidates that have led on these issues, and we go to bat for them. We knock on doors. We shared a bus out to Worcester a couple months ago, knock on doors for our environmental champ candidates, and it's a really exciting part of what we do.
How many members of ELM in Massachusetts?
There are about 12,000.
And was Thoreau the original founder, by the way? Is that true?
No.
Let's make it true.
Yeah, make it true. Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. was an early board member, but no Thoreau.
Okay. Carlos, what are you up to?
So thanks for the question, for the kind words. So professionally, my partner JP, who's here somewhere, and I opened up a public affairs and communications firm a year ago, and that's going well. But I'll focus on our work in this space, which is really takes up most of our time, and we're just thrilled to continue to make a difference in this space. One of our partners is based right here in Boston. It's called Deploy.us, and this is an organization that's designed to help empower and amplify right-of-center organizations that are active on climate. So there are conservatives out there, there are Republicans out there who care about this issue in a very sincere way and who are acting to try to change the Republican Party. But nobody knows about these groups. These groups are small, they're underfunded, they don't get a lot of attention from the media. So something we want to do is help these groups grow, become more prominent, and help build out the coalition that's necessary if we're going to get bipartisan climate action. So we have groups that focus on evangelical Christians who care about the environment and want Congress to act. We have groups that work with military veterans who are worried about the environment, or people who come from national security backgrounds, business groups, obviously. We're looking to strengthen this coalition and empower it so that we can change this narrative that climate or the environment is a partisan issue, or that if you're a Democrat, you need to care about it, and if you're a Republican, you can just dismiss it. That comes through communications and by lifting up and empowering the voices of conservatives and Republicans who are for meaningful climate action. And then another group we work with is called the Alliance for Market Solutions, and that's based out of DC. And essentially that group advocates for a market-based solution for climate change, which is a price, a transparent price on carbon that's applied across the economy.
I should say that tomorrow I have a story on about a church in Stoughton, an Episcopal church, that's wrestling with the question of whether it should cut down a forest behind its church it owns to make a solar array farm. Listen to it. Please.
Hi, thank you all. My name is Michael. I'm actually also a member of Sunrise Boston. Hey, Anissa. I wanted to hear your thoughts about how we fight the influence of fossil fuel money on climate action. We talked about polling. We know the public is there in terms of wanting climate action. Politicians are not. A lot of that gap is probably fossil fuel money and the incredible organizing really that they've done over the past several decades in getting politicians from Democrats and Republicans to promote denialism. So how do we fight that? Yeah.
Ooh, very interesting. Great question.
Can I add a few stats to that question? So the Green New Deal is actually a ridiculously popular policy program for what it is, because it's normally portrayed as like this radical thing, but 60% of U.S. respondents to a poll are in full support of a Green New Deal. And if they're in full support of a Green New Deal, that means more than 60% are in support of some sort of climate action, right? And something that Sunrise and a bunch of other environmental organizations have kind of done over the last few years is to ask a lot of politicians at all levels of government to sign what we call the No Fossil Fuel Money Pledge, which is refusing to take money from any fossil fuel lobbyists or CEOs, and but still taking money from fossil fuel workers is fine because it's the CEOs and lobbyists who are in power. And actually all of the presidential candidates have signed that, and we're trying to get a lot of down ballot congressional, state, local politicians to sign that, just to kind of even the polling numbers that we see to what the politicians are actually doing.
Can I just add something quick on, and this might be a little provocative, but when it comes to solving this crisis, I think it makes most sense to focus on the target, and the target is carbon pollution. That is what causes climate change, carbon pollution. How do we build out the coalition of citizens and organizations that is necessary to meaningfully address that? And this is not a defense of fossil fuels. I don't work for any fossil fuel company. I have no interest. But you're starting to see major companies like ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, all of the European companies, British Petroleum, Shell, advocating for carbon pricing. Again, another indicator of how far we have come. And you can be skeptical. You can criticize their proposals because a lot of them want legal immunity. They don't want to be subject to lawsuits. And it is fine to criticize them for that. But these companies are starting to accept or come forward and say, we know that this needs to be solved. And I consider that a positive development. That doesn't mean I'm going to close my eyes and follow them wherever they want this to go. But the people who are advocating for pricing carbon, for other kinds of solutions like clean energy standards, whatever it is, I don't disqualify anyone who is proposing ideas that can make things better. That doesn't mean it's enough, but this is so serious and so dire that I think we need to be welcoming people in, not putting up a gate at the door.
Elizabeth, you want to take a shot at that?
I mean, one of the things that I think is just really hard about this is that over 85% of the root causes of climate change come from the extraction and combustion of fossil fuels. And if we're going to solve this, some really big business models are going to need to change fundamentally. And I think the No Fossil Fuel Money Pledge is terrific, and I've just been sobered by the continued influence of the fossil fuel industry in elections across the country. And I guess my eyes have really been opened at ELM to how pernicious those forces that would like to maintain the status quo are.
Bruce, can I
Sure.
take
Yeah,
your role here for
take
10 seconds and ask a question, and maybe one of my panel colleagues wants to answer, maybe someone from the audience wants to answer. If tomorrow we discovered a way, whether it's carbon capture or something else, to burn oil and natural gas without a single molecule of carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere, would it still be the goal to shut down fossil fuels?
I mean, are we
Yes.
are we fracking? I mean, how are we getting this stuff out of the ground? And what about co-pollutants? Like, I mean,
Okay, no, I'm not. There's no. I'm not. This isn't a test, and I'm not grading the answer, but I just, I think that when you want to solve a challenge, they're shutting down fossil fuel companies and eliminating carbon pollution are not necessarily the same thing.
I guess one thing
That's
I
all
want to
I'm saying.
point out about that is Exxon knew about climate change since the 80s. That was before I was born. And to Elizabeth's point, that like even if the fossil fuel companies are like maybe they're realizing that their business would be more profitable if they switch to renewables. All of the infrastructure that these fossil fuel companies have are for extracting fossil fuels. So they would need to dramatically change how they do their business. And I just don't see the fossil fuel companies leading on switching themselves.
So just before we came here today, just minutes before, the Harvard Faculty of Arts and Sciences voted to divest by 179 to 20 to call on Harvard to divest from its $40 billion endowment. That's big money. It's chump change compared to what happened in Davos when it was Lawrence Fink, who's the head of BlackRock, which is a $7 trillion money management company. $7 trillion is an unbelievable amount of money, said that climate risk is investment risk. And then what happened, it was Jim Cramer on CNBC, I think, who's the big guru, I suppose, of investing, said, I'm done with fossil fuels. So we're seeing a very dramatic change just in the last few minutes.
And by the way, that shows markets work. No government is forcing any of these individuals to make those decisions. They are reacting to perceived risks and to public sentiment.
That's a really inefficient way of markets working, though, I would say.
I agree. Be most efficient to have a carbon tax, and everyone pays for the cost of pollution.
I would say the most efficient way would be to invest directly into renewables rather than waiting for the market to discourage people from using fossil fuels.
So carrot and stick.
Yeah.
But we're investing in renewables. We have tax credits, which are tax expenditures.
It needs to be a lot more for the time scale that we need.
Let's take
Maybe
a
this
question.
question
You've
will
been very patient.
Yeah. So my name's Munir Azam. I've been in the renewable solar industry for a very long time. My question is that this country actually mobilized in a way that we needed back with World War II. I mean, if you really look at what this country did, and I would recommend a couple of chapters out of How to Hide an Empire about exactly once we were recognized the threat of fascism, the country developed all kinds of solutions to the rubber shortages, to quinine shortages when the Southeast was out of our control, to a whole range of industries completely changing their model to address fascism. But that had a Pearl Harbor event that triggered it. Do you think that actually what will result in the mobilization that we need? is something of a Pearl Harbor.
I heard a term for this just this week. It's called a green swan event. Have you ever heard that? Right? There was the black swan events, these things that shouldn't have happened, come out of nowhere. The green swan, and it came from the International Bank of Settlements, which is like the bank of banks of banks. You know, it's the clearinghouse for the country's banks, the sovereign banks. And the risk there is, I mean, think about it, in Hurricane Sandy, right? If we start getting Hurricane Sandys on a regular basis, we start losing New York and Boston, you know, Paris. I mean, is that what it's going to take?
Well, I think it's just happening gradually. I don't think there's going to be one event, but as local communities start waking up to this, whether it's tidal flooding or these hurricanes, we're most exposed to hurricanes, and they're getting bigger and stronger. And I tell people, make sure you correctly connect the dots. We don't have hurricanes because of climate change. We've been getting those for hundreds of years in the Florida Peninsula, but they are bigger and stronger and more frequent because of climate change.
Right, that's called climate disruption. So let me ask you, Congressman, so if there's a road, right? It goes right through your district, right down through the Everglades.
Tip, yeah.
Right? And there was a price tag put on restoring some of those roads. It was like
It's already happening. It's already happening. There was
$180 million
there was an outbreak
of
of anger in the Keys because the government came forward and said for the first time that they won't be able to save every road. And of course, the people who live on the roads that are not going to be saved are very upset about that. So this is a new phenomenon, but we're going to see it more frequently all over the country. And again, that's when this becomes real to people and the silliness starts to come to an end.
Mm-hmm. Sir.
Hi, this is a question for Mr. Curbelo. I'm going to bring this a bit more to the coming 2020 election. I was wondering if you are planning on supporting the Democratic candidate, and forgive me if that's a bit direct, but if not, how do you justify that? And if so, how would you convince other Republicans to do the same?
So I have never been afraid to speak my mind and be honest. In 2016, I didn't vote for the president. I think I was the second Republican who said, I'm not voting for the president. That's not a political decision. It's a moral decision. So I don't know what 2020 is going to look like yet. There is a difference, especially for a Republican, in Democratic candidates. And I think there are candidates that can unite the country and build a coalition of support to solve the major challenges we face, this one being the most significant, but there are others, issues like immigration, Social Security and Medicare are going to have to be addressed here in the coming years. There's a long list of issues that have fallen victim to this hyper-partisanship over the last 20 years and haven't been meaningfully addressed. And then there are candidates who, in a way, they represent a change from the president, but who, similar to the president, lack a unifying capacity and lack the disposition and I think the approach that can actually deliver solutions as opposed to charging up people politically while not actually solving it.
Are you going to vote for a Democrat for president?
Look, I'm not. It's not a decision I've made, but I've always said that we should all put the national interests above any political interests, always, and that goes both ways.
Elizabeth, has Elma endorsed a political candidate for president?
No, we don't have a federal PAC, so we just endorse at the local and state level.
Well, I want to thank you very much. We can go on and on and on, and I really appreciate you coming here. Thank you very much. Yanis, thank you. Elizabeth, thank you.
Can I just actually take a moment? I don't know if people realize how special WBUR's Earthwhile is and what it means. I know a lot of people in this room did a lot to make Earthwhile happen, and it's really a gift to Boston and to Massachusetts, and I think a gift to the nation, which is suffering kind of a crisis of journalism. So thank you for making this possible.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much. Elizabeth Turnbull Henry from Elm. Congressman Carlos Curvelo, thank you so much. Thank you. And Yanisa, I am not going to try to pronounce your name. The next up is the March 31st at 7 p.m. The Get Educated series is going to dive into the issues around the economy with WBUR Bostonomics reporter Callum Borchers. You can register online at wbur.org/cityspace. Thank you so much. Great questions.